Hi everyone, welcome to the Voices of Change conversation with myself and the three presidents of GU, QMU and GUSA. I'm Uzma, the university's race champion and vice principal.
Hi, I'm Vivek and I'm the GUSA president.
Hi, my name is Fuad and I am the president of the GUU.
Hi, my name is Lachlan and I'm the president of the QMU.
The university's actually been on a journey since 2018 on its campaign around race and racism and how we improve things at the University of Glasgow for both our students and staff. It kicked off in 2018 really when we published our first report on slavery, abolition and the University of Glasgow, really challenging ourselves to look at the role of the university in that time. In 2019, a report was published by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which really shed a light on universities and racism sort of across the sector. And it caused us in senior management to take a hard look at that and think, well, we should do our own and investigate the experiences of our own staff and students. So we did that in 2021, which led to the publication of Understanding Racism, Transforming University Cultures and our action plan. And as part of the action plan, we launched at the end of last year our campaign on Together Against Racism, One Team UofG. And this is what we're here to talk about today. So, as you know, this campaign was designed to be quite hard-hitting and provocative, and we did that pretty deliberately. I've got a few questions for you, if you don't mind, off the back of that campaign, and I'll maybe draw on some of the things that we've touched on as part of trying to get the message across to our students and staff about racism, how it feels and how it impacts on people. Can I ask you a question, and can I ask you, where are you from? How would you respond to that, and what goes through your mind when somebody asks you that?
Whenever I get that question, I kind of immediately recognize like there's several levels to what this person might be asking me. But no matter what motivations they have asking, I always just say I'm from Ireland because that is a place where I've come home and where I feel the best attachment to. Do
you ever get a follow-up?
Yes.
Where are you really from?
Yes, very frequently, and from people that I've considered quite close friends in Ireland as well. And it's every time it's like, I'll answer your question, but that's not a great question to ask. And if I had to answer that question, I would say that my family is from Nigeria, although my connection to Nigeria is not the same as my connection to Ireland.
I find that one always quite difficult. I'm a mixed race student at the University of Glasgow, but I was born in Australia as a first generation child, so it's very hard to really locate exactly where I'm from. My family's got lineage from, France, Vietnam, a bit of Japanese, and then Irish on my granddad's side. So it's a bit of a mix. It's always hard, really, to locate, but probably have to say Australia at the best part of it.
It's an interesting one because for me, similar to Lachlan, I've got family from, I think you have to go a few generations back before my family goes to India because they're all actually from East Africa, and that's got its own history and how they migrate to the country. So if someone asks, oh, you've got African history, they don't always associate that with you. That, and sometimes they don't associate that. My accent means that even though I was born in Scotland, I've lived here for quite a long time. It's always a question. It's a weird one. I think, like everyone said, it's layered with multiple things.
What would you prefer they ask if they're curious about your ethnicity? Because I guess people naturally will be, and part of the discussion is how do we make race easier to talk about?
I think it's somewhat hard to answer that question because it's probably slightly different for everyone. Personally, what I've always preferred is if someone just asks me directly what they want to know instead of indirectly. So it's kind of like, instead of where are you from, where are you really from, how about where's your family from? Or, oh, where do you trace your lineage back to? And it's like, it's a more inconvenient question for some people, I guess, in that there are more words than where are you from. But I think it's worth taking the time to just specify what you mean because it's clearly a really sensitive issue for a lot of people.
My own experience is the same as yours. The minute somebody asks me, it takes me a while to respond because I think, right, I was born in Germany, should I say Germany? Nah, didn't stay there long enough. I lived most of my life in Glasgow, but we moved around various places in and around Scotland and the rest of the UK. And then you always think, why is this person asking? And instantly your radar goes off and you begin to think, are they wanting to know because there's some overt form of racism, or are they genuinely interested in your background and your heritage?
I feel like sometimes as well they want to hear a certain answer. And I think sometimes I've had it where depending on who it is and who it asks, I decide to change it up. So like you said, Germany, sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm from England. Sometimes I'll say, oh, actually, I was born in Glasgow, just to see their reaction, because seeing the way that they'll be like, oh, you don't sound like you're born in Glasgow. And then sometimes if you say, oh, I'm British or whatever, just to see and almost like force them to make that relevant, the next question, and they don't want to obviously ask it as well.
When someone asks that question, unfortunately, sometimes it comes a bit like a defense mechanism to think about what they're trying to ask, and sometimes you can kind of read the person wrong. Definitely as a mixed race person, I feel sometimes if someone asks you that question, they're clearly asking because they see I might have something else, like another race in me. So sometimes it feels a bit targeted, even if it's a genuine question, because some people are just interested. So I think it's sometimes difficult because you just take the wrong reaction to it immediately. So it's definitely trying to like open up that dialogue.
When I look at you, I don't see colour. How does this land with you? You can see the intention behind it.
I definitely see the intention behind it, but I also just hate that message so much. I think, while it's important to be like egalitarian and believe that everybody has value, I think there's also a lot of value in the different experiences that you have, particularly as a person of color, or particularly as someone from a different country or a different even region in the UK. I think there's value in diversity and differences, and you need to listen to the differences of different people and their different experiences and how that's impacted their lives, opposed to trying to blanket it all out and be like, let's all now be on equal footing, because it doesn't really work like that.
It does make me quite angry. It almost completely negates all of the struggles that you've been through. For some people in this country, it's considerably harder. Saying, oh, I don't see colour, just completely negates that. And I think it's important to, yes, recognise where you want to be and make sure you want to be equal, but also not forget that history that everyone's gone through. And I think when that statement comes up, it's just like, it is frustrating.
You know, we all have cultural differences and different things we celebrate. There's no reason why everyone can't be involved in that celebration, but you know, we shouldn't just blanket over it and just say we're all equal, we're all on the same footing. So I think definitely looking to celebrate the diversity, especially within Glasgow and at the university as well. I think we have such a diverse cohort. So it'd be a massive shame if we just, you know, as Phil said, just blanketed over it and just saw one linear way of seeing how we look at race.
To visualize it, if you see the world as like a Mario Kart race, which sounds absurd, and you have some people who got to start the race at the very start and have now finished a lap, but then you have mass groups of people who didn't get to start the race, and then very out of nowhere in like the late 90s, the late 1900s, they are suddenly allowed to start the race. They are now way behind everybody else in the race, but to say that the racers are now all equal isn't necessarily true.
It's interesting because we've had quite mixed feedback, really positive feedback on the campaign, but also some feedback where people of colour have found these quite triggering without the context when they've seen the posters go up. And I guess, did this land with you? Did this campaign land with you in that sense? Because I think this discussion's been useful, hearing your reactions to some of these quotes.
For me, I think it's tricky, and I don't want to obviously speak for everyone. I can only speak from my own experience, and if someone did find it triggering, then I completely understand that. But for me, I like some of these quotes as well, because I'm like, they are definitely quotes that I've heard myself, and I thought it was actually quite nice for them to almost be aired to people so that people can get a far better understanding. People often don't think that they've asked me that, or people won't be like, oh, really, do people ask you that? I'm like, yes, more than you can actually realise. So having that aired to your everyday friends is actually quite good.
I think my opinions in the campaign are somewhat complicated, and it's maybe based on what information these students will hear immediately. So when I first saw the campaign, the only thing I saw were the posters, and the first thing I thought was like, that's kind of really uncomfortable to see if I'm just trying to go to the library and study, and I'm seeing these like vaguely traumatic, vaguely offensive things that people possibly said to me, and just seeing it everywhere in the wall, I'm like, this is a bit weird. But I do think like events like what we're doing here, and when we're talking about it and actually engaging and kind of giving more than what you see on just the posters, that's really important. But at the start of the campaign, when all you see is that as a person of colour, it's not really a great thing to see while just trying to go about your day, go to study, go to lunch, etc.
A lot of these questions, a lot of these quotes, they can seem innocent at the first instance. You know, a lot of people might just ask him because they are being genuine. But I think it's powerful enough to make someone look at it and go, right, why is this statement, why is this question on this part of this campaign, on this poster? And it makes them maybe consider the language more, to be a bit more empathetic and, you know, even sympathetic to some causes, because, you know, they are pretty blunt questions at the tip of it, because it's pretty black and white just saying something like that. So it might make someone think a bit more, you know, how can I phrase this to be, you know, both polite and generally interested, but show that I am in a better way. So I think that part of the campaign's been quite good, because it's something that I've said to my friends. It's like just don't be lazy around these issues, and just show that you care, and that's enough for me at times. Just care. So yeah.
And actually that was the point of the campaign. It was to raise awareness that sometimes what might come across as an innocent question or a question that's been posed without much thought can have quite a big impact on people of colour, because they have been exposed to these type of questions. And one of these quotes are actually direct quotes that people in our university staff and students have had directed at them. So it was to bring that to the forefront, and the fact that we're having this conversation with 3 student presidents of colour together with myself, I think is a huge kind of leap forward.
It's just airing that these actually do happen, and I think
which one?
all of them, to be honest.
Yeah.
I was thinking this one in particular as well.
Yeah.
Can I call you something more normal? But I think it's like that happens everywhere. Like my name's not particularly difficult to pronounce, but even then I often go by Viv just because it's quick and easy, and I sign off emails like that, and a lot of the time people won't call me my full name, and yeah, fair enough, it's a bit of a nickname and everyone's got nicknames and stuff, but more often than not it comes from because they can't pronounce my name properly, and I'm sure you guys must have had similar experiences as well. But I'll go on you.
I love my name. I really do love my name, but it is so frustrating. It's not even what people say. I get that my name is somewhat Arabic, and it is Arabic, and the pronunciation isn't really clear when you're just looking at it. But it's the way people choose to spell it when emailing me or sending me letters. That is the most frustrating thing. But I think it is also important, especially with names that you're not familiar with, to recognize that you're not familiar with that name and maybe double check you're spelling it right, or if you're going to say it and you think you might have said it wrong, ask the person, it's like, how do I properly pronounce your name? And that is never an unwelcome question ever. So just be aware of the things that you may not know.
We're going to pick up some questions now from our staff and students on our Instagram. I'm going to turn to you. What has been your experience of encountering racism in Glasgow?
Yeah, I've definitely experienced racism at Glasgow and Glasgow University. I think, and I was mentioning to the guys just then before, the bar's changed, the line in the sand has moved. You don't have to be carrying a Confederate flag anymore to be considered a racist or have racist undertones. You don't have to be bleached blonde hair with a Nazi armband to then considered to be a racist. I think there's a lot of little things that happen. Obviously, you've got all these comments here and there. And again, maybe it's because I have been a little bit more desensitized to it. Maybe a comment like, oh, where are you really from, isn't to me anymore considered that deep because I've had much worse said to me. But it's only at a second glance when someone's maybe pointed it out to me. And it can be a white person or a brown person who may have pointed it out to me. But it's like, oh, actually, you know what, now that you say it, that is a little bit racist. I went to clubs and nights out and Punjabi MC came on. And everyone was like, oh, Viv, go dance. I'm like, all right. And maybe initially I was like, oh, this is quite funny. I can dance there and I can do some Punjabi dancing or Bhangra dancing or whatever. And it was fine. And I played up into it. And then the more I thought of it, I'm like, this is a bit shit. Like, I'm not your circus animal. I'm not someone that you can just sort of put something in front of me and just expect me to, perform for you. And that was one thing which eventually I came to the realization of, and that really irked me a little bit. And it's again this idea of they don't see colour in the workplace when it's convenient for them, but then when they want to be entertained and when it's on their platform, they're more than happy to bring race into it. But then when I start talking about race in the workplace, everyone all of a sudden shuts up about it. So I don't think it's necessarily like what has in the past been perceived as racism. I think it's now a lot more subtle and a lot more changed. And I think because there's more education around it, people have got better. But I think there's still a lot of racist undertones. And I think there's things that we can constantly be doing and we can always be growing.
First of all, I really agree with what Vivek was saying just there, which is like the experiences, the negative race-based experiences that we have are often quite small scale, to the extent that when you grow up with those things, you just stop realizing and you just stop seeing it at all. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't affect you. It doesn't mean you're not hearing them and you're not able to process them. Just sometimes you need to say oh, someone said this to me once, haha, and then they're like, it's not really bad. You think about it, so it's like, oh yeah, that's actually quite bad. I wish I didn't say that. But I think overall the impact that kind of you end up getting to is that do you just feel different by being a person of color in a majority white space? And that's not to say that feeling different is bad, but sometimes you feel kind of like, why am I here? Should I be here? For example, I'm a physics student. I walk into my physics classes and it is like not a single person who looks like me. And then when you couple that with tiny statements that people make, things that seem innocent but are actually quite offensive or just kind of hurt, that all adds together to make this environment of, why am I here? Should I be here? Am I welcome here? What is my future here? And all those big kind of questions. I think there's also a really important thing to recognize when you're listening to discussions of race, particularly when you're living in the modern era, when the boundaries have changed, and you're like, I don't say anything directly racist, which is when you listen to the voices of people talking about race, very often the first thing you think of is the older generations, the people who have started this fight first. And they're going to talk about much more explicit and much more harmful experiences about race. But just because I'm not talking about those same experiences doesn't mean that I don't still experience I don't still experience racism. It's more that the world has gotten better, boundaries have changed, but we should by no means become complacent just because it's better than it used to be.
I can recall a couple experiences of overt slurs being thrown on my way, but as Vivek kind of said, growing up, you kind of get desensitized to those, and then you kind of build a barrier, a kind of shell around those sort of things. But I think, as Vivek said, it's the small things that you reflect on later and realize, actually, no, that actually wasn't okay. I remember being in Freshers Week in my first year back in 2018, and everyone goes, yeah, we know you're half white, but it's kind of like a racial guessing game of what the other nationality is, Chinese, Korean, Japanese. They just keep going on rather than just asking. And stuff like that is a small thing that people might think, oh, we're just trying to figure out, but you can just ask. I don't want to make a big scene, or especially in Freshers Week, you're trying to make friends. You don't want to be that person that's, looking like a social justice warrior, even though, you look back and go, actually, that made me really uncomfortable at the time, but I just let it go because I wanted to make friends or something. So it's quite a difficult area, because I think especially as international students coming here will always find that is you really want to make friends, so you kind of let a lot go. And with the campaigns we've got, it's great to see it, but I think at the end of the day, when you're put in certain social situations, you kind of have to let it go, which is unfortunate. But hopefully with the campaign, it just opens more dialogue for people to talk a bit more freely about these sort of things.
A couple of things that you've all said absolutely resonate. So firstly, that amount of time it takes to process when somebody has said something, you don't react instantly to it, because no matter what your experience is, even if you've become desensitized to it, it still takes you back a little bit, and you have this slight wobble, as in, I didn't like what you said, but I'll play the game and I'll go along because I don't want to create a scene. But it affects you because you think about it afterwards, sometimes for days, and you think that wasn't right and it didn't make me feel great. I grew up experiencing the direct racism that you both have touched on, and it was a very different type of racism for me growing up in Glasgow. And I see it in my children now, they get a different slant of racism. It doesn't make it any better because it's not, explicit, but it's still something we as an older generation really have to be mindful of. But even in those senior positions, when you have, removed some of the barriers and got to the top of your field, you still experience it in different ways, and it's about kind of learning how to navigate it and actually educating other people that, think about what you say and how you say it.
I've discussed it with these two guys before. Coming into meetings with, from all levels, from university to the union, sometimes people look to you, especially when looking for a certain demographic of students, just because I'm Korean doesn't mean I'm able to access the whole entire Asian student base. But, sometimes when they talk about the Asian student demographic, you get a quick glance, and it's not even verbal, it's just a physical action that maybe only you see. And so one of that situation is really tough to talk about because no one else will see it. Yeah. But at that time, it really just knocks your confidence.
It's small things, but I think particularly for our generation, it's the jokes you make and the things you think are in good fun or good banter. And I think this conversation comes up a lot when we're talking about like gender-based violence and the really bad jokes that guys need to train themselves to stop making. It's a similar thing, perhaps to a less harmful extent, but still harmful for race jokes. For example, when I'm in a club and there's a Kanye West song and the N-word is just dropped very hard, people will look to me to sing it, or they'll be like, haha, Fua, you do that thing. And it's like, okay, I will say it just because I'm in a club space and this is the best way to fit in. But it's like, that's not really a joke you want to hear all the time. And maybe for some people that's an okay joke, but I think that's also why it's important to talk openly about things you don't understand and things you're not sure if you're going to be offensive or not. Talk to the person. If somebody were to talk to me beforehand, it's like, are you okay with those jokes? I would probably say yes if I am comfortable with that person and I know that they understand and are willing to listen when I tell them to not make a different joke. But it's a matter of just being open with the communication.
Yeah, I want to echo both of that. I also want to add what you said as well. I was going to ask you a question. Have you ever made jokes and stuff on purpose? I sometimes it's still as frustrating as ever, but I've started to maybe lean into it a little bit more and be like, I'll bring up a topic right in the middle and I'll just sort of throw it in and be like, what's everyone's reactions to that? And just see if anyone's going to pipe up. Or for example, it's like a big one, when you've obviously had jokes and stuff, it's like if I'm with a particular group of friends who I know sometimes can be a bit sensitive and people they're obviously trying to change and be very careful and stuff with their words, but sometimes I'm like, is it because I'm Indian? Is it because I'm brown? And obviously this is a bit of a joke, but I know they're not being racist, but sometimes it does. Obviously it's maybe a little bit mean on my side to make them feel uncomfortable, but also I find that probably the better way of dealing with it, because sometimes instead of being like, oh, you shouldn't have said that, you shouldn't have done this, sometimes when I pose it in that way, it's quite an interesting way to sort of see how people react.
There are two jokes I make in regards to race. There are jokes that are kind of like against myself that I wouldn't want anybody else to say, but I say it just because I find it amusing, and perhaps it's a way of dealing with the low-key trauma that you experience, but just joking about it. It's like, haha, this. But also in meetings, I agree. Sometimes I do make the odd joke just to see everybody's reaction, just to make people a tiny bit uncomfortable. But it's kind of like, I'm fine with that if you're feeling slightly uncomfortable about me making a race-based joke in a meeting. How do I feel being the only black person in this meeting?
I think sometimes it is good to make them uncomfortable because, most people thrive in uncomfortable places, and that's what gets the most discussion out there. So I think sometimes it is good just to prevent the guard against complacency, to make sure that, okay, they are thinking about what they're saying in case anyways, and it's better to probably use that in the smaller things before something overt bad happens. But I think, in meetings it's a bit trickier, but it is interesting to see, especially with senior management, how they might respond, because we look at most senior management across the UK, we see mostly older, elderly white men in high positions. It's getting better, but sometimes it is interesting to see how they react and how they respond to new ideas.
I think for me it's been tricky recently as well, because one of the things we've all probably tried to do in our respective unions has been tackle race in some capacity, but then obviously there's so many things we want to try and do, and I've not had it said explicitly in my face, but I've had a very close friend and confidant always say to me that this is what's been said behind my back, and they've said, and the general sentiment seems to be, Vivek always makes it about race. And when I heard that a few days ago, that really, really riled me up, and it actually kind of upset me, because I was like, it takes a few conversations and you guys are already thinking that I'm bringing up race too much, and I think you guys probably feel the same way. I actively try and avoid bringing it up as much as I can, because that it makes people feel uncomfortable, whereas this is probably the most comfortable I've felt talking about this in a long, long, long time, where you sit and you just completely open and frank and just discuss it. And I don't talk about it a lot to my friends. Sometimes they ask and I'm like, oh yeah, this does affect me, but it's only like a 5-minute thing before I immediately change the topic again. But in terms of friends and even meetings and stuff, I really actively try and not bring it up.
You've all given me your perspectives and experiences of encountering racism in Glasgow, but I guess one of the questions we've been asked is Glasgow a racist place? And when you answer this, I want you to think about actually what we're doing here, and the fact that we are, talking so openly and honestly about race, and the fact that the university is committed to holding a mirror to itself and saying, what are we doing wrong? How can we make things better? So what's your view on this?
If you were to ask me, I think the question is Glasgow racist and is University of Glasgow racist are completely different questions in that they're kind of completely different groups you may interact with. And I think particularly when you're thinking about a wider city, when you're visiting any city in the world, particularly as a racial minority, it is an unfortunate truth that you have to think about what will the people in this area treat me as and what will they see me as and how much racial history exists around that. Like, for example, me and my friends were considering going on a trip to Eastern Europe, and I was like, I can only go to capital cities because if I go anywhere else, I don't know what experiences I'm going to have. But to bring it back to the question, it's hard for me to answer the question directly because I am one racial minority. I don't know what anybody else has experienced. I can say that as a black student, I've not experienced anything that is super overtly racist and it's very directly made me feel uncomfortable or unwelcome. There are obviously the microaggressions and they have an impact on how welcome I feel and stuff like imposter syndrome, etc. But overall, I do think Glasgow, personally, is quite a welcoming city, and the University of Glasgow and the diversity on this campus is quite welcoming. But that isn't to say there aren't problems that need to be solved.
The tricky one to answer because, obviously, like I said, I grew up in England, which has a lot more overt racism. I think the way that I put it, Glasgow, and maybe as an extension of Glasgow, Scotland, isn't as racist because there's not as many ethnic minorities. I think that's almost the crux of it. It's like, this still exists, and maybe it exists or in a, like you'll get less racist cases on campus, less documented cases to the police, but that's because there's just less brown people, less black people, less East Asian students, whatever it is. But yeah, I think racism will still exist. And I think it's almost a too nuanced question just to answer without really looking at the data. But I think, yeah, you will experience racism when you come here. That is just the sad reality of it. You're probably going to experience racism in most places that you go to in some capacity or another.
It's definitely a tough question. Like Phil had said, I can only speak from personal experiences. But yeah, it's two different questions about the university and Glasgow itself. I find being in Glasgow, there's a lot of different places to go to meet different communities, and you can be comfortable in your own community because you can find different groups and go into that and go just be comfortable. We've seen it with students who stay in one community and don't really expand out of that, which it's not always great because you want the whole city to benefit from the diversity. But I think in the end, the university have great programs, platforms, and if you have an issue, you can go to them. And then the student bodies, I think in particular, have a special voice on campus that we can go to these certain meetings as a group of 4 student bodies and propose these things that hopefully get taken seriously. Sometimes it's tough as a student, but I think as Vivek said, and even Phil, you will run into racism somewhere, whether it be at a pub, somewhere, in the West Scotland, there's going to be levels of it because, as Vivek said, they're just not used to seeing different cultures in some certain areas. And, I don't think it's them being overt and trying to be racist. It might just be genuine. Oh, when we're surprised to see someone like you here, we might say that. And again, it's the innocent question or the innocent phrase, which is a bit uncomfortable. I think the university has a great diversity cohort, as I said before, and you will find societies, you will find different groups, clubs. Last night was the Volunteering Club Society Awards, in which they have an award for diversity in societies, and the university is actively promoting and recognising societies and clubs who are promoting and really focusing on diversity. So I think that's a really good thing to see, and actually championing change is a big thing the university is actively trying to do.
You said the university is committed to doing quite a lot, and it has declared its intention to be an anti-racist institution. Do you think the senior management group are living by that commitment, and is there more we could be doing?
I think it's a difficult question to answer because from a student perspective, it's whether or not it reflects onto the students. Anything that is being done has to be accessible by students to engage with the content that they're putting out. If the senior management team are putting stuff out that just isn't being engaged with, isn't accessible, isn't being understood by the student body, well, then nothing's going to change. And I think as long as we're making content that people can actively understand why the university is doing this and why they've taken certain stance, then we will see change, we will see action, and we will see that, okay, they are committed, and we can see that. So it's definitely having input perhaps from students as well at the higher level to say this hasn't really worked in a campaign or this will work better. So I think the fact that we're having a discussion here, the fact that we're able to speak so openly, perhaps is a good step. I think Vivek said earlier, it's the most comfortable I've been talking about race whilst at the university. So I think definitely we're seeing action being made, and I think there is levels to it, and we're in the right direction.
I think that the university, and as Lachlan has said, has made very good and ambitious commitments to championing diversity and champion race equality and targeting racism directly. And I think generally these are all very good things to focus on, and I'm happy to see my university focus on it. I think the weakness the university will have is diversity among senior management and diversity among some meetings that are important to the student experience and student issues. For example, one committee that we all sit on as student body president is the Student Experience Committee. But when I go into those meetings, and this is a meeting of people who largely decide and talk about and make plans for the student experience at Glasgow. I think a problem that exists for this meeting is once I'm gone, once Vivek is gone, once Lachlan is gone, where is the representation? If all of our successors are whites, which I said earlier is fine, then where is the representation in that room? Who is going to be making the decisions? Is it going to be a group of only white people that are going to make the decisions about how to best cater to people of color? And while that won't always lead to bad outcomes, I think when you haven't experienced something yourself, you probably don't understand it as well as the people who are actually experiencing it. But I do think representation within meetings is something the university should think about long term.
You can't really tackle these issues without having a voice who understands it. That doesn't mean that a white person can't champion that, because if you only ever champion the protector's characteristic that you exhibit, then you're never going to create change. But I think you have to engage with the voices, and if there isn't enough of the voice at the top, then that's where it comes down. The culture is created from the top, and if it's not starting from senior management, then it's not going to happen, and it's not going to happen quick enough.
Got another question that's come in. Do you have any advice for being a good ally as someone who is nervous about getting it wrong? So.
I think the best advice for being a good ally is just listening. You can read books about the opinions and different ways of thinking. You can watch podcasts, you can listen to the news. But what's most important is the actual lived experience of the people around you that you have the largest impact on when you have the largest impact on their experience. So it's talking to your POC friends, and having this open discussion, like, tell me about your experiences, tell me about the negative things you've experienced, and also being willing to say, tell me about the bad things I've done or the negative things, the things I've said that's had a negative impact on your experience, and being very open and willing to listen and not making them feel, most importantly, not making them feel guilty for telling you these things, and making it feel like it's okay to tell me. I'm not going to take it personally. It's just a way I can improve. We have that open discussion, and then we can move on and become better friends because of it. And so listening is really the most important thing.
Yeah, I think everything Fuad said, I think from experience, people get very defensive very quickly. I actually had, again, because of what happened last week, I had to bring up an email and I sent something to someone, and I then found myself being made to feel guilty because I'd called someone out a little bit, and they're like, oh, I take accusations of racism very, very seriously, and I'm hurt that you made me feel that way. And I'm like, so you're hurt that I made you think that you're a little bit racist? So how do you think I would feel? And it's almost, again, making it about yourself. And I think, like I said, listening and being really understanding and wanting to learn. And I speak as a man as well. Like, I'm sure I've said things that are misogynistic and sexist, and I'd want to be called out as much as I can and just be like, yeah, I'm sorry, I messed up, I shouldn't say that. How can I get better? And that exact same thing applies to racism as well. And also, I think, I don't think any of us will feel upset if someone made a mistake and they tried to correct themselves. Like, it's the obviously said, we mentioned questions like, oh, I don't want to be wrong or don't want to seem wrong. Like, I don't think any of us really care if someone comes wrong and says something, and they're like, if it's with a good intention, it's the intention behind it. I think that's where it comes from. It's like, I know, like, I've had very, very close pals sometimes make a joke, and I'm like, you know what, it's actually fine because I know it's in good jest and you're close enough pal and I know you don't mean anything by it. But then sometimes you have comments and stuff which are in bad intention, and I think there's nothing wrong in making mistakes. It's the intention, the willingness to grow, and the willingness to want to be better.
Something that just came to mind as well that's really important is that you also, when you're having open conversations with the people around you, is you need to be aware of what you're asking of them. If you want to talk about their personal experiences and ways you can make their personal experience better, that's fine. But don't come to someone of color and tell them, so what do you think is institutionally wrong about the racism in the UK? And it's kind of like, I don't want to talk about this. This is not something I even feel comfortable or knowledgeable enough to talk about. But also, if everybody asked me that, it is just exhausting to be, oh, I am your diversity person, so therefore I must tell you about all the problems that exist with diversity in an entire country, or an entire system, or an entire institution. Don't be aware that some people don't want to explain the same thing over and over and over again about something that's widely true or widely effective. And maybe the focus should be more on personal experiences if you don't want to bother someone. If they want to have that conversation, it's fine, but just be aware of what they're willing to engage in.
It's about, don't expect us to be the experts on everything about race and racism. It's too much.
I had a mate, and he was telling me that some of his friends, like he was a black friend, and they all started asking him how he felt when Nelson Mandela died. And he's like, I'm English. I've grown up in England my entire life. But he's just like, oh, so how do you feel? Maybe it was a sort of thing where it probably came from like a genuine kind of good place, but it was just like, what? And I think, yeah, it's just a funny story, and it's like, it just reminded me a little bit of it. So,
on being an ally, I think one thing all of us have touched on today is that our individual experience doesn't speak for everyone. I think, you know, my experience as an Asian student does not speak for every student who is of Asian descent. And I think that it's about, with your friends and close friends, it's about nuance. You know, they might be comfortable and should be able to come to me and ask me questions, but that doesn't mean they can approach any Asian student and ask the same questions. I think it's definitely just, you know, finding the right time to ask questions. You know, it's I think Vivek talking about it a bit, was saying, like, if someone just brings something up out of the blue and you're not really expecting it, you go, why is that coming to your mind right now? So, like, you know, if it's a quiet time, just chilling out, you can just ask, like, oh, by the way, this is something that's happened, or I have a question about this. Don't wait till it's maybe a heated moment where you just ask something a bit rash, you know. So yeah, I think it's just having the nuance to understand the different social situations as well. Not everyone is comfortable speaking about race. If you're trying to be an ally, just making sure that you're aware of social situations and aware that someone might be uncomfortable, or think about how they would feel if you asked a question. I think that's probably the biggest piece of advice I would have. Just think about think about the power of your language, basically.
I think that's so important. Not everyone is comfortable talking about race, and that's not just about white people, that's about us as well. Each of us have had personal experiences that are probably, even if they happened many years ago, are still really difficult to talk about. And we're not experts, we don't speak for everyone, we don't even speak for members of our own community at times, and I think it's just important, if you're an ally, to remember that we don't claim to be representative of everyone else's voices, we reflect our own experiences. All right, here's your chance. Final thoughts, anything you want to get off your chest, or even talk about what's next?
I think often when these kind of conversations occur, and maybe it's a fear on our part as people of color, but it's a fear that people are going to be scared to engage with us for fear of offending us. It's particularly with this campaign, when you see stuff that might be like kind of okay, you think that it's okay to say, and then you're like, oh, what else am I saying that might be a microaggression? I think don't be too scared of talking to actual people of color and asking about their experiences, because for the most part, honestly, and maybe it's because we're very used to these kind of things, but for the most part, we're willing to listen and we're willing to accept when people say things that aren't necessarily right. To tell a personal story, I once met one of my ex's little cousins, and what she said to me when she saw me was, "Are you from Africa?" And then the next question is, "Have you ever seen a lion?" And it's kind of like, that's funny. It would be incredibly problematic if somebody else said that to me, but it's like, it's a kid, and I understand the different circumstances that this person comes to. And while that's an outlandish example, it's true generally in that when people come to me with something and they say something that might be slightly off, I'm not going to judge them or think they're a really bad person. I understand where they're coming from, and I am also a rational individual. So trust in my rationality when you come to me with something, and trust the rationality of your friends when you come to them with something. They'll understand as long as you come from a good place and with good intentions.
I think we've talked about people who might succeed us in our roles. Vivek said, it might just be a coincidence that all three of us here today happen to be here at the right time, right place. So I think for people coming in after us, don't be afraid to engage with different societies, communities, clubs, because that way you will still get the involvement. You don't need to have a person of colour being in the presidential role just to engage in societies, communities and clubs. You can still facilitate them within your spaces and support them. So I think just, be happy and ready to engage with communities who want to engage with you, but just don't know how, and just put your front foot forward and make sure whatever you're offering within the university, within your unions, within your student bodies, that you are a safe space for people to come and throw ideas and put stuff on and celebrate their cultures and diversity.
I think for me, maybe a bit of advice to people fellow age people of colour. I've always found that we stick out, and we do stick out, right? I've had incidences where, for example, I've been in the Hive queue and I've pushed in with a group of friends, and we've all pushed in and we all should get kicked out. But I've been the only one who's been picked out and sent to the back because the bouncers recognise me. And I think that then got me thinking. I've had these experiences because you stand out, because you're recognisable. You've then got a sense of duty to be better than normal, to be better than good.
I've just loved speaking to the three of you today. It's been one of the best conversations I've had since joining the university, and your honesty has been so refreshing. I think just on reflection, as a member of senior management, I really don't want to lose that attachment from reality and what happens on the ground and the experiences of our students. I find it really interesting that my experiences are probably, decades older than yours, but a lot of the stuff that you're still saying is absolutely still resonating with me. The things you say about how people's attitudes and behaviours can affect your confidence, how you still feel as if you stand out in meetings, that awareness that you have that you may be the only person of colour in the room are really powerful points to feed back in me. So I will take a lot of this away and reflect on it and make sure we drive this campaign forward, because we are, as we said at the start, really committed to the change. And I think just hearing these voices of change, I think, has been absolutely brilliant. So thank you. If you've been affected by any of the issues that we've raised during our conversation today, or you want to find out more, please do visit our campaign website. It's Together Against Racism on the UofG pages. On that, you'll find a whole range of resources on how to be a good ally and many other aspects of anti-racism and online tools. We also have our own online reporting tool if you've experienced racism either on campus or beyond campus that we can support you with.